宇宙をかけるで。Let's Harrier!
Oh, Majima. Never change. You know how it is. One moment you walk into Sega high-tech land, hoping that they'll advertise your up-and-coming cabaret club. The next moment, you've sunk 4 hours into Space Harrier. I mean, I don't know how that is. In that time I'd be playing Outrun, but I expect the experience to be somewhat transitory, so I can kinda put myself in your shoes. This is Space Harrier on the arcade as played in Yakuza 0. As far as I'm aware, this is arcade perfect port, and I've always thought of Space Harrier as a little bit of a strange game. I'm a big fan of the Yu Suzuki Superscalar games, but this one always sat in a weird place for me compared to the other three of the big four. Whenever I mention Yu Suzuki in my videos, I inadvertently always end up with a bunch of comments talking about how no one ever mentions Space Harrier, and I find that to be really bizarre because I have the complete opposite experience. I get nothing but comments talking about Space Harrier. Where are all the Outrun fans at? But another place where Space Harrier sits weirdly for me is the fact that I have a lot of experience with three of the big four Yu Suzuki Superscalar games, those being Hang On, Outrun, and Afterburner. And I have experience with them because I had a Sega Master System growing up back in the day. However, I didn't have a lot of experience with Space Harrier. Granted, I played a knockoff game here and there, and I did play 1 or 2 games of Space Harrier over the years, but I never really had it growing up. And it makes me question whether my love of the other ones is simply nostalgia, because I just don't think as highly of this one as the others. Don't get me wrong, it's a perfectly good game, but just something about it isn't quite as good. But we'll get to that in a bit. You are the Space Harrier, equipped with space pants, moon boots, and an awesome rocket disco laser of death that will propel you into numerous monsters on your adventure to save the Fantasy Zone. Because it's Opa's day off. Or maybe he's in therapy. I mean, seriously, look at the plot of Fantasy Zone. Those games are actually surprisingly dark. This game is similar to the other Yu Suzuki Superscalar games in that it's an arcade game that takes place in the third person, and you are trying to get the highest score possible, usually by propelling yourself forward. However, of the other three, it feels the closest to Afterburner because it has a combat element to it. The idea is as you're flying through the Fantasy Zone, or running, because you can go on the ground for reasons that don't really make a ton of sense, you can fly around and shoot all the various enemies that come flying at you. And these enemies have a wide variety, and that's really cool because it does show that this is kind of a strange, fantastical, and wonderful world. It really does sort of emphasize that this is, in fact, a fantasy zone. The core of this gameplay is, of course, the fact that it is an arcade game and you want the highest score. And like the other Superscalar games, the key to getting the highest score possible is, for the most part, just to survive. Go as far as possible. And unlike half of those games, you can actually fight things. You have to shoot things, you can blow stuff out of the way, thus allowing you to get extra points just for destroying environments or any other hazards that come your way, as well as having to avoid some that are indestructible. Now, what makes this game completely different from the others is this game actually has bosses, and this is where I actually think this game gets really, really cool, because you end up fighting like giant dragons and like giant walls of stone heads that just breathe fire at you and other crazy stuff. It really does feel imaginative and interesting, and it does make you want to play more just to see how different the Fantasy Zone is, because there is an absurd number of different enemies that actually have different properties. For example, in the first couple of levels, because that's all I have recorded, seriously, I was just playing to unlock the advertising for my cabaret club, so I only have the first few levels recorded, but all the different enemies behave somewhat differently. You have the giant opening and closing black flowers that are completely invulnerable until they're attacking you and you have to line up with them. You have enemies that hop around on the ground. You have enemies that come up from super far in the distance, fly off the side of the screen, and then come straight at you. And not all of them feel inherently hostile. Some of them just feel like they're there. You know, they're native parts of this environment that you are just trying to blast through as fast as possible, and they're not necessarily there to do you harm. And that's interesting because comparatively to, say, the enemies that fly directly at you or the ones that indeed start firing at you, it does feel like this is a huge different world. You know, you've got things that are just parts of this environment that are just trying to survive, and then you've got others that are active hostile enemies. That's brilliant. And every single time you defeat a boss, or at the very least finish an area, the world transitions to almost a different landscape that feels completely different, with different ground obstacles and enemies. It is just amazing. I love how this does give you a sense that you are progressing in this world and you are on an actual adventure. But it's interesting that I use that word, adventure, because as I said at the beginning, this is the Yu Suzuki Superscalar game I hold in the lowest regard, and that might be because of nostalgia, or lack thereof comparatively. But my favorite Yu Suzuki Superscalar game, Outrun, that's a game I would consider to be an adventure, because at the end of every area, not only would the environment change, but you could pick where you wanted to go. You were given the option. It feels like that game did the whole adventuring element just a little bit better. Now you're probably wondering why that's relevant. Well, it's sort of the embodiment of how I feel about this game. I can trace little bits of this game to the other three of the big four, and it just feels almost inferior to all of them in all regards. As previously said, it's kind of not quite as much an adventure as, say, Outrun is, and while it has a combat element similar to Afterburner, it feels a lot less deep. You're simply flying around and shooting straight, as opposed to Afterburner, which required you to get a missile lock on enemies and fire individually, which actually required you to not attack for a brief period of time, as well as having to actively dodge attacks, which feels a little bit less in here. It feels like you move almost sort of randomly around. And while it's nice that there is an option to invert your controls a little bit, the controls feel hypersensitive, although that might be just a matter of the fact that this is an arcade game ported to the PS4 controller, and there's just a little bit of a weird translation to the actual joystick controls. So that's understandable. But if you compare this to, say, the motorcycle racing game Hang On, it has nowhere near the same sense of speed either. And that's kind of what I feel about this game. It feels like it's trying to do almost everything that the other games are doing, but to a lesser extent. Now the fact of the matter is, it does actually predate at least two of them, from what I can tell. So it could just be that those two happen to take cues from this game and push it further, in which case that makes it all the more impressive. And it makes this one all the more impressive because it's sort of the starting point for those concepts. But at the same time, if one game is going to appeal to all of you, this is the one that sort of overlaps all of them, and it's just not going to be quite as interesting. Don't get me wrong, I think Space Harrier is a great game. In fact, I think it's significantly better than its sequel, Space Harrier 2, on the Sega Mega Drive, because, let's just be honest, it is. It has a way better soundtrack, and, you know, it has awesome bonus missions and stuff. But I think if you were just to compare this with the other Superscalar games I played when I was a kid, it's a lot harder to see it as way more impressive. It has the fantasy elements, but that's the edge it has, and that's the one thing it has over the rest, really. And if you want a fantasy shooter, I mean, on the SMS or even in the arcades, I would recommend Fantasy Zone. In fact, having played this enough in Yakuza, I unlocked Fantasy Zone and then immediately played the crap out of that again. But, you know, it's good, but if you put yourself in my shoes with my experience, it's just not quite as interesting as the rest. That said, it is a Yu Suzuki Superscalar game that involves shooting, giant dragons, lots of bright pastel colors, and tons of insane enemies, and it's an excellent arcade game, and that alone makes it kind of a must-play. Now, the overall presentation to Space Harrier is, honestly, as down as I sound about the rest of the game, it's pretty legendary. The overall visual design is amazing. I talked about how the world sort of shifts after every level, and that cannot be understated. Every area feels like it's its whole new world, with its completely unique enemies and monster designs. And yeah, sure, the monster designs just feel like they have no connecting theme whatsoever. On one hand, you have a Cyclops woolly mammoth. On the other, you have a three-eyed Dom. For some reason, maybe it's compensating for the woolly mammoth. It does feel like the enemies are just a hodgepodge with no centralized theme, but I mean, it's the Fantasy Zone. In fact, it might be multiple Fantasy Zones over the course of multiple worlds. Who's to say that they are connected in any way? Maybe they don't need to be. Maybe I'm just looking a little too deep into that. But I think visually this game is quite impressive and varied, and I love the Space Harrier's animations for running. Seriously, I don't know why, but I just love running in this game, even though it's not really all that smart too, because you effectively cut down your evasion by about 90%. It's that running animation, man. It's good. And audio-wise, come on. The Space Harrier theme is insanely good. It's probably one of the most iconic arcade soundtracks I've ever heard. Again, only comparable in my head to the other Superscalar games. The soundtrack is similar to the actual game. It's excellent in pretty much all regards, and it's really just a matter of opinion whether this game's going to be better or worse than the rest. Now, if you want a copy of Space Harrier on the arcade, well, I mean, go find an arcade cabinet and try not to spend a stupid amount of money. If it's like the other Superscalar games, there's probably 2 different versions of it. Honestly, I like the big sit-down ones because these Superscalar games had like just insane premium arcade style sit-down cabinets. They were awesome. That said, that's not exactly practical for most of us. If you happen to have an SMS like I did back in the day and wish I did now, you can get this game for less than $10. But that said, as much as I love those Superscalar games on the SMS because those were my childhood, I can tell you those games were not very good ports. They were rough. You could hear the SMS grunting and wheezing trying to put out something as high speed and as awesome as Outrun, as Afterburner, as Hang On, as this. I'm seeing a PC Engine cue card for about $15. That's not bad. I actually have the ability to play Hue cards now. Maybe I should actually invest in one at some point. Something to think about. There's also Space Harrier 2, which I've already reviewed, and I can tell you the soundtrack and everything about it is just sort of lackluster compared to this game. Gameplay-wise, it's very similar, just not quite as good as the legendary Space Harrier. There's also a modified version on the Sega Ages system for the PS2. I've never played any of those, but that's about $30, which seems a little bit high. I've heard hit and miss things about those compilations. There's also apparently an arcade perfect port on the Sega Saturn. Cheapest one I'm seeing right now is $50, which is a lot. I probably wouldn't spend that much if it was Outrun, and that's my favorite of the lot. And I mean, if you've got $15, $20, you could go buy Yakuza 0 on the PS4 right now and play that. And honestly, you're gonna get Yakuza 0, which, having been playing that recently, that game is amazing, and you get a metric crap ton of other awesome arcade games, mini games, and seriously, I'm gonna have to review Yakuza 0 sometime soon, but I'm really getting into it, kind of getting into the rest of the series, gonna have to find other iterations of it. But this is Space Harrier. It's a game that I missed in my childhood. I had an incomplete set of the Superscalar games, and that might be why I don't think it's quite as good as the other 3. But that said, even if this one isn't quite to my tastes comparatively, it's still an excellent arcade game, and I think it stands shoulder to shoulder with the rest of them, and all of them were some of the best arcade games I've ever played, certainly some of the best arcade games from Sega from the time. Maybe ever. And if you have any way of playing Space Harrier, you should, because it's damn good and it's a big piece of arcade history. Because without this, well, maybe Yu Suzuki wouldn't be as famous as he is. Maybe there'd be no Shenmue today. Maybe there'd be no Virtua Fighter or Daytona USA. Seriously, this is potentially the linchpin of a lot of Sega history right here. And even though it's far from my favorite, because, I mean, let's just be honest, it's no Outrun, it's a damn good arcadey blast. If you have any way of doing so, I suggest you take a trip down to the Fantasy Zone, and then while you're there, maybe play some Space Harrier. Or, you know, stick around playing Fantasy Zone. That was a pretty sweet game, too.